Spring 1944, Berlin. Deep inside the reinforced bunkers of German High Command, the air hung heavy with stale cigarette smoke and the smell of fear. Intelligence officers gathered around a massive oak conference table, their eyes scanning a sea of black and white photographs, intercepted radio transcripts, and frantic reconnaissance reports. They weren't looking for the British fleet. They weren't tracking the massive buildup of Soviet armor in the east. They weren't even looking for Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. They were tracking one man. His name was George S. Patton, and for the men charged with defending Hitler's fortress Europe, he was a ghost, a phantom that haunted their strategic planning day and night. For months, the Third Reich had devoted more intelligence resources to tracking this single American general than any other Allied commander in the war. Not because they hated him, but because they understood him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the legendary senior German commander in the West, a man who had conquered Poland and France, kept a specific file on his desk. It wasn't about troop numbers, it was about Patton's psychology. Rundstedt knew that the invasion of Europe was coming. He knew the Allies would land somewhere on the French coast. But he didn't care about the logistics. He cared about the spearhead. He knew that wherever George Patton appeared, the line would break, and he was terrified he wouldn't know where that was until it was too late. To understand why the German General Staff, the most professional and ruthless military organization on earth, feared Patton above all others, we have to look through their eyes. We have to read the reports they wrote. We have to sit in their command cars as the reports of shattered front lines came screaming over the radio. Because the story of George Patton isn't just about an American hero. It's about the enemy who respected him enough to fear him. The Germans first tasted this fear in the dust and heat of North Africa. November 1942, Operation Torch. Before this moment, the German Wehrmacht had very little respect for the American fighting man. They viewed the U.S. Army as soft, inexperienced, and overly reliant on machines. They expected the Americans to be slow. They expected them to be cautious. Then came the landings on the coast of Morocco. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, putting 35,000 men ashore in a complex amphibious operation. German observers, watching from the hills and reading reports from Vichy French defenders, looked for the typical American sluggishness. They didn't find it. Patton didn't consolidate. He didn't wait for perfect supply lines. He attacked. Within 3 days, he had crushed resistance, secured the massive port of Casablanca, and forced a surrender. It happened so fast that German intelligence in the Mediterranean couldn't update their maps quickly enough. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a Luftwaffe general turned ground commander and one of the most brilliant defensive minds of the war, immediately flagged the name Patton in his reports to Berlin. Kesselring was a scholar of war. He requested a dossier on this American commander. Who was he? Where did he train? The answers that came back from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, were deeply unsettling. The report detailed a man who didn't fit the profile of a democratic general. Patton wasn't a manager, he was a warrior aristocrat. He spoke fluent French. He had competed in the Olympics. But more importantly, the intelligence file revealed that Patton had spent his entire life studying German warfare. He had read Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks, in the original German. He studied the campaigns of Frederick the Great. He walked the battlefields of the First World War, analyzing where the German Kaiser's army had succeeded and where it had failed. Kesselring realized with a jolt that they weren't fighting a typical American. They were fighting a man who thought like a Prussian. But the true shock came after the disaster at Kasserine Pass. In February 1943, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, launched a devastating offensive against the Green American II Corps in Tunisia. The attack was a masterclass in German maneuver warfare. Rommel's panzers smashed through the lines, sending American troops fleeing in a chaotic, humiliating rout. Equipment was abandoned. Morale collapsed. It was the low point of the war for the U.S. Army. German high command was jubilant. They believed the Americans were psychologically broken. German high command was jubilant. They believed the Americans were psychologically broken. They predicted it would take months, perhaps a year, to rebuild that force into a fighting unit. Then George Patton took command. Patton arrived at the Second Corps like a thunderstorm. He imposed strict discipline instantly. Soldiers were fined for not wearing ties, for unshaven faces, for sloppy salutes. It seemed trivial, but it was psychological reconstruction. He told them they were the best soldiers in the world, and he promised them victory. Within 2 weeks, just 14 days, German forward observers noticed a terrifying shift. The same American units that had run away at Kasserine were now probing German lines with aggressive, coordinated attacks. The hesitation was gone. The fear was replaced by a cold, professional violence. Rommel himself, exhausted and sick but still sharp, noted the change in his private diary. He wrote that the Americans had suddenly become audacious. The speed of the transformation was impossible according to German military manuals. A broken unit stays broken unless it is led by a genius. This was the moment the obsession began. The German High Command realized that Patton was an alchemist. He could turn raw, frightened conscripts into killers. But if North Africa was the introduction, Sicily was the revelation. July 1943. Operation Husky. The Allied plan was conservative. General Bernard Montgomery and the British Eighth Army would be the sword. Patton's Seventh Army was supposed to be the shield, protecting Monty's flank. The German commanders in Sicily, General Hans Valentin Hube and Field Marshal Kesselring, prepared their defenses against Montgomery. They knew Monty. He was methodical, dangerous, but predictable. They ignored Patton's flank. The terrain there was mountainous, rugged, and considered impassable for heavy armor. Patton didn't care about sanity, and he certainly didn't care about being a support player. He unleashed his forces in a lightning drive that stunned both his allies and his enemies. He split his army, sending a column to capture Palermo in the west, a move the Germans considered militarily pointless but psychologically devastating. Then he turned east. German units stationed in the mountains suddenly found American tanks grinding up goat paths and narrow switchbacks. General Hube found himself in a frantic race. Patton was driving his men so hard that he was beating the motorized German columns to the escape route. Patton arrived at Messina hours before Montgomery, standing on the docks and looking across at Italy. German after-action reports from Sicily were filled with a mixture of professional alarm and begrudging respect. One officer wrote, "The American General Patton fights with the aggression of a panzer commander." But just as the Germans identified him as their primary threat, Patton disappeared. August 1943. The slapping incidents. The scandal exploded. Eisenhower was pressured to fire him. The American press vilified him. German intelligence watched this drama with absolute fascination. They couldn't understand it. In the Wehrmacht, a general slapping a soldier for cowardice was discipline. When they heard Patton had been relieved of command and sent to England, they were suspicious. They decided that Patton's disgrace was a cover story, a deception. They believed the Americans were hiding him, saving him for the decisive blow. Spring 1944, England. The Allies were preparing for D-Day, but they had a problem. The Germans had a massive reserve of panzer divisions sitting in France. The Allies needed to trick the Germans into keeping those tanks far away from Normandy. Enter the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. This was a fake army. It existed only on paper, in radio signals, and in the minds of German intelligence. To sell the lie, the Allies built fake inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft, and empty barracks. They generated fake radio traffic, simulating thousands of troops. But the deception had one final, crucial ingredient. They gave this ghost army a commander, George S. Patton. When German radio intercepts picked up that Patton was headquartered near Dover, the tumblers clicked into place in Berlin. Of course, the German generals thought, it all makes sense. Normandy, that would be the diversion, a feint to draw our forces away. The real invasion, the one meant to end the war, would come at Calais. Why? Because Patton is there. Hitler swallowed the bait whole. So did Rundstedt. So did Rommel. On June 6, 1944, when thousands of ships appeared off the coast of Normandy, the German reaction was paralyzed. Field Marshal Rundstedt screamed for the authority to release the panzer reserves, but Hitler hesitated. The High Command hesitated. They looked at the map, they looked at the weather, and then they looked at where Patton was. He's still in England, they told themselves. This is a trick. For 6 critical, history-altering weeks, the unparalleled might of the German Armored Reserve sat idle in the Pas-de-Calais. They waited for an invasion that never came. They waited for a ghost army. They waited for Patton. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The Allies were ashore. The deception had worked, not because of inflatable tanks, but because the mere name of George Patton carried enough weight to freeze the Wehrmacht in place. August 1st, 1944. Patton was finally unleashed. He took command of the Third Army in Normandy. The lion was out of the cage. If the Germans thought they knew what speed looked like from North Africa and Sicily, they were unprepared for what happened in France. Operation Cobra had broken the German line, and Patton poured his divisions through the breach like water bursting through a dam. This wasn't an advance, it was a stampede. Patton's doctrine was simple: hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. But in France, he didn't just kick them. He eviscerated them. He ignored his flanks. He ignored supply shortages. He ordered his tank commanders to bypass resistance. "Let the infantry mop up," he screamed over the radio. "Keep moving." German command and control collapsed. General von Kluge found that his maps were obsolete every hour. He would order a division to hold a bridge, only to find that Patton's tanks were already 20 miles past that bridge. German soldiers retreating east were stunned to see American columns racing parallel to them, or even ahead of them. The psychological impact was devastating. The feeling of being constantly outflanked broke the will of the German soldier. Then came the Falaise Pocket. Mid-August, Patton saw a chance to encircle the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Inside the pocket, it was hell on earth. Artillery and air power rained down on the trapped German columns. Roads became choked with burning vehicles and dead horses. It was a slaughter. 50,000 Germans were captured. 10,000 lay dead. The roads were so thick with carnage that pilots flying overhead claimed they could smell the death from their cockpits. Generals escaping the pocket reported to Berlin that the American Third Army was a hydra. But the defining moment, the moment that cemented Patton's legend, came in the snows of the Ardennes. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler played his last card, a massive secret offensive designed to split the Allied armies. Chaos reigned. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. The room was somber. The generals looked at the map. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George," he asked, "how long will it take you to turn your army and strike the German flank?" The Third Army was currently attacking east. Patton would have to stop, disengage, turn 90 degrees, and march nearly 100 miles through a blizzard. Military doctrine stated such a maneuver would take weeks. Patton didn't blink. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Some of the other generals chuckled nervously. They thought he was insane, but Patton wasn't boasting. He had already called his staff before the meeting. He had already issued the code words. While the generals were debating in Verdun, Patton's tanks were already turning around on the ice-slicked roads. When the German offensive commanders looked to their southern flank, they saw the impossible. Patton's tanks were coming out of the snowstorm. The German astonishment is recorded in their logs. They simply could not believe an army could move that fast in those conditions. Patton smashed into the German flank, relieving Bastogne on December 26th. He had performed the most difficult maneuver in warfare, in the worst weather of the century, in 2 days. After the war, the interrogation rooms were busy. Allied intelligence officers sat down with the captured titans of the Wehrmacht, Rundstedt, Kesselring, Jodl. They asked them point blank, which Allied commander did you respect the most? Which one did you fear? The answers were consistent. They respected Montgomery, but they didn't fear him. He was too cautious. But Patton was different. General Gunther Blumentritt said, "We regarded General Patton as the most dangerous and aggressive of all the Allied commanders." General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, said simply, "He was a man of great initiative and bold action." So, why did they fear him? It wasn't just the tanks. It wasn't just the shouting. They feared him because he broke the rules. The Germans were masters of war because they understood that speed and violence were more important than safety. Patton was the only one who realized that the only way to beat the Germans was to out-German them, to be faster, to be more reckless, to be more violent. He was the mirror image of their own dark genius, reflected back at them with the overwhelming industrial power of the United States behind him. In the end, the German generals feared George Patton because when they looked at him, they didn't see an American. They saw themselves. And they knew, better than anyone, just how dangerous that could be.